Hello and welcome to Common Sanity. My name is Simon Evans, and this week my guests will be Hadley Freeman, Hugo Rifkind, and David Baddiel, whose book Jews Don't Count has just been published to much acclaim and will form the basis for this conversation, chiefly about the rise of anti-Semitism within the ranks of the progressive left, who normally like to think of themselves as above such things. We have a delicious lunchtime menu, which has been provided as ever by the Il Portico home delivery service, which is called Home James. And if you'd like to enjoy the same delicious cuisine, then there is a link to the Home James menu in the description for the podcast. You can get a 10% off voucher. And of course, it goes without saying, I highly recommend that you do so. The food is astonishingly good. Absolutely the best you are likely to find delivered to your home during the remainder of lockdown. Look forward, of course, to seeing you at the restaurant itself, Il Portico in Kensington High Street, where we host these lunches when sanity does indeed return to these islands. Let's crack on with the lunch.
Oh, this is delicious.
You've started, have you? Well, the only bit that's ready in mine is the wine, so I suppose I better open the wine because
Cheers.
Everything else is a bit al dente.
I can't drink the wine.
Is that because of Lent, David?
No, partly because I don't drink anymore very much. I do occasionally, but also I have another event. I have Tortoise. Sorry to mention a different podcast type of event, but I have them later on. And if I drink half a bottle of wine, I will be asleep for that.
Yeah. You're doing a thinkin'? Is it one of those thinkins?
Yeah, one of those things. I mean, this is my life now. Yeah. Essentially endless looking at my screen, thinkings and podcasts and whatever the equivalent is of a long read.
Kind of better than having to schlep around London, though, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. And actually, the only one that I'm meant to turn up to is Jewish Book Week. Mm-hmm. We were very keen on that, and I've sort of gone off it since Josh got ill. Yeah. Actually, I'm like, no, it's still really dangerous out there.
I guess the problem you have at the moment, David, is the more attention your book gets, the weaker its argument becomes.
There is that side problem, except some of the attention it's getting is very aggressive.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, sure.
Yeah. Is the attention it's getting from enthusiastic right-wing sources as well? Are you being accused? There are some black podcasters in America who have a sort of non-BLM narrative, and they're constantly accused of just playing into the right's agenda and being everything that they want them to be, you know.
Well, when the book first appeared, I did notice I got quite a lot of, including yourself. I'm going to include you, Simon, in that.
Yeah.
Of people who are on at least the right of centre, but you, Konstantin Kisin, is that his name, and Andrew Doyle.
Yeah.
All those people wanted me to come on and talk about it there, and I think I only said yes to you because I love you, and I don't. And the reason that is I am very, very keen that the book isn't, even though it's happening, obviously, but co-opted into a kind of side on the culture wars.
Yeah.
For me, it's a book of complex analysis of a very specific issue. And yes, it's a critique of progressives, but if it becomes a totem of the right, that's not useful. For me in the discussion. I don't want it to be something that progressives are beaten over the head with. And actually, the beating over the head that needs to be done to them is helped by that not happening. So in the book, I talk about how one thing progressives do, which I find very disturbing, is assume that anti-Semitism, concern about anti-Semitism, is now owned by the right.
Yes, very much like free speech, which is Andrew Doyle's other thing, as you say. It's weird how certain things which used to be absolute shibboleths of the right wing, you know, things that we were.
Of the left wing.
Of a wing. I mean, it was a shibboleth of the right wing that you were anti-Semitic and you were against free speech, I suppose. Yeah. You know, if you want to talk about extreme right wing in that sense.
Yeah.
And and anti-free speech.
You're right. Free speech is the same. Is free speech. One would feel, certainly 20 years ago, is something that probably people on the left would be shouting about a lot, and feel, if they felt it was under threat, would feel it was their thing and in their lane. But now, that's sort of been pinned as something that the right shout about. And weirdly, anti-Semitism, which obviously at its heart is a deeply, deeply far-right idea, somehow or other, when, as I say in the book, when Keir Starmer announces, that he supports the EHRC thing about Labour and is trying to mend bridges with the Jewish community, that is clearly an attack on the left, right? The third thing that basically saying I am an anti-racist is an attack on the left in this particular thing.
I mean, one of the things that's become apparent, certainly, I think, post-Trump and Brexit, but maybe earlier than that, is that old left-right distinctions are not terribly useful. Most people now share grids every so often, sort of quadratic grids in which you identify which quarter you're in. And I've seen a strange shaped sort of triangle as well, which demonstrates that there can only be, libertarianism can only be right-wing, but you can be a libertarian or an authoritarian left-winger. You know what I mean? It's these attempts to sort of, I think there's going to have to be a globe soon, and you'll have to say I'm roughly Indonesia or something like that to sort of describe.
Well, actually, I'm writing an article at the moment. I've sort of got slightly talked into it by the Sunday Times about the culture wars.
Yeah.
And one of the things I'm saying, as I'm trying to find out what I want to say about it, which I'm not sure I know yet, is that, I grew up at a time in the 70s when politics was still really all about money, basically, money and class, and therefore it was straightforward. You were left wing if you supported more money for poor people and the working class, and you were right wing if you thought basically let the rich get on with it. And now, because that doesn't happen anymore, it is much more confusing, because if your politics are about culture, then that's very abstract and harder to pin yourselves in, and leads to all this. Oh, well, being concerned about anti-Semitism can somehow be right-wing and all the rest of it.
Because left and right, it lasted for 200 years, didn't it? Almost to the day. It began with the French Revolution, and it was essentially, do you support the Ancien regime? Do you support private property and the rights to own a chateau? Or do you think things should be redistributed? Yeah. And it was almost to a day, to 1989, when it all just suddenly caved in and became something very much more curious and gnarly. And I mean, just to sort of address what you said right at the beginning of this conversation, the point of this podcast, really, Common Sanity, is to try and address those issues without getting into that sort of heatedness, which seems to distort everything, because these are things everyone is interested in, but nobody, I think, that I know, wants to feel as angry about them the whole time. They used to be things that you could talk about a little bit more congenially.
Yeah,
they've become absolute flashpoints, and I don't quite know why that is, because, as you say, left and right used to be about economic issues and levels of taxation, but far right for a long time has probably been about immigration, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's because, well, as with all of these things, it's very boring to say. It's a lot to do with social media, and social media is a marketplace not really of ideas but of identity. And as I've said before in my stand-up shows, outrage confirms identity. That the way of being loud and saying what social media really is saying, here I am, that's really what everyone's saying. With every single post, here I am. One way of saying that very loudly is to get really angry about something. And there's now a multitude, and as you say, a patchwork or a globe of things to be angry about. Still, everyone who's getting angry wants to say, I am this or I am that. So it's still aligning yourself to somewhere on a political map, but it's all over the place.
Did it used to be football? Was football what we had before social media, where if you took your football seriously, you had to actually get your fist bloody at the end of the match?
Yeah, I feel I'm talking too much, but I will say one thing about that, which is Satnam Sengara, who's just done this book about empire, which is really good, I think, Empire Land. He sent out a tweet recently because someone got really angry about it, saying, yeah, but our history isn't a football club. And what he meant by that is that person felt blamed, and that not so, and that he was a supporter of empire, of the heritage of empire, of Britain or whatever, and that this critique of it was like an attack on his identity, as it would be if I'd said all Spurs fans are cunts.
Yeah.
Right? Rather than sort of trying to absorb what Satnam is saying and find a new truth or whatever. So I do think there is a footballiness to the way that people talk politically now.
Now,
I'm
Hadley,
going to look at my food.
Brilliant. Okay, that's perfect, because I wanted to bring in Hadley and Hugo here now. You keep an ear primed, keep an ear pricked, is it? Hadley,
It might
I've
be.
got to apologize to you. I didn't realize you had a book addressing the issues we wanted to talk about, because James booked you, said, oh, I know Hadley and she'll come on and she'll be great. But he didn't say, and you need to read her book. I downloaded it this morning and I've been listening to it at double speed on Audible so as to catch up as quickly as I can. And I'm pretty good at that.
I'm so sorry, Simon. You've had me chattering
It's
in your ears
fantastic.
this
I don't know. I don't want to turn this into another one of me proselytizing Audible at double speed, but it's the only way I can absorb information now. Audible at regular speed, I get distracted by other things because the information's coming too slowly. But as long as somebody can speak clearly and you're your own narrator, which is obviously ideal. But it sounds like you had a pretty extraordinary family, and you've dug back into the past to dig them out of the 20th century. And I mean, I haven't got them all, but I've already met kind of Picasso and Coco Chanel or something close enough. Did that surprise you? Did you know you had that kind of?
It did surprise me. I do not come from a very glamorous family. I know those of you can't see me, I know, listening to the podcast, but the other people here, they can see my very glamorous sheep jumper. Not a very glamorous person. My dad grew up lower middle class in Long Island. My mom's from Cincinnati. So I was surprised finding out these connections. My great uncle Alex really kind of discovered Christian Dior, and Dior worked for him as a draftsman. He then became this very close friend of Picasso's and Chagall's and lots of other artists. And then there are lots of other crazy figures throughout my family's history. My great uncle Henri and Sonia, in their latter years, lived next door to the Ayatollah Khomeini while he was in hiding in France. He was just outside of Paris. So there's lots of weird brushes with history from my quite sort of, I don't want to insult my family, but my quite sort of dumpy, average Jewish family. But that wasn't why I wanted to write the book. I mean, the finding of the glamour stuff just came through the process. I really wanted to write a book about the story of a Jewish family over the 20th century, and these particular four siblings all took very separate paths during the war, and what happened to each of them. But where it started was really wanting to write about my grandmother's sadness. My grandmother moved to America at the beginning of the war, and when I knew her as a child and teenager, she was always incredibly sad, and always wanting to go back to France. And I wanted to write about that because when you're an American Jew, you grow up thinking, oh God, the Jews who came here from Europe, they're the lucky ones. How lucky to be in America. Of course, all European Jews wanted and still want to come to America, the land of Disney World and freedom. Yet I lived with I had my grandmother right there who was the living rebuttal to that. Like, she hated being in America. She hated her American husband. All she wanted to do was to go back to France.
Yeah. Can I ask, this is it may be completely irrelevant, but why did you come back from America? They do seem to generally enjoy a better quality of life, and there are more types of climate available.
It's true. It was my dad's fault. He got a job in London when I was in the 6th grade, and so we all moved to London in 1990.
Oh, right.
And stayed there ever since. Although I then moved back to New York in my late 20s and was there for a long time. And while I was there, I managed to meet someone who worked in the London office of The Guardian, which was really annoying because then I had to move back to marry him. So much for my New York adventure.
I was going to say, your accent didn't survive from your 6 years in
Do you
New
think?
York.
I never know how I sound to people. Like, everybody always thinks I sound different. To me, I sound American, but to you, do I sound English?
No, you sound American to me, although I would struggle to say exactly where. Where would you say, Hugo?
America. Definitely America. I couldn't be more specific.
I think I know Texan, and it would be Texan. But then Texas has thrown us all a curveball this week anyway, isn't it? So
yeah, indeed. But I just want to add something to what David was saying about why these culture wars are so heightened now. And I think it's not just because of social media. I think that's something. Sorry, David, I'm adding something to your previous.
That's fine. I've got lasagna.
Great. TV dinner.
About why these culture wars are so passionate. I don't think it's just because of social media. I think it's expressed on social media. But when you read books like Jonathan Haidt's The Cuddling of the American Mind, which is a really interesting book that's mainly about America, it's, this whole idea that these kids who grow up on campuses, go to college campuses in the States, they're told their ideas are so important, identity politics are all. And his whole theory is, this is failing our children. It's not equipping them for the outside world because this will not work in offices. Actually, what's happened is the outside world has become like those campuses in a lot of institutions, not all, but something like the New York Times, for example, and to a certain extent, the Guardian, like liberal institutions now reflect that idea that identity politics is all, personal experience is all, younger people know things, younger people are here to teach older people how to be. There was that completely fascinating column in the New York Times this week in Ben Smith's media column about the recent resignation of a journalist who had taken a bunch of rich, American kids to Peru and had used the N-word or something not in a, I mean, it's hard to say not in a derogatory way, because obviously a derogatory term, but I think he was quoting somebody or something.
It was in a conversation about whether that word had been used in rap lyrics. He was asking for clarification on where somebody else had used it, and he used it rather than saying the N-word.
He said the word rather than what we now, say the N-word and everything. And the kids complained, and he eventually resigned. And one of the kids said in this column to Ben Smith, I was so surprised, when I'm around relatives who are over 65, I say things to them like, you're not supposed to talk like that, and I'll correct them. He actually said the word correct, and they usually apologize, but he didn't apologize. And I mean, you don't want to sound like some old kook going, these youngsters have no respect, but like that attitude that the young now have to have, so much plus.
A lot of people have been saying that that's a very frightening development. I mean, I allow myself sometimes to sort of dream up catastrophic scenarios, because life is a weird mix, and has been for some time, of sort of banality and also hovering apocalypse. It's a weird time to be alive. But of all the great terrors that afflicted mankind in the 20th century, obviously from a Jewish perspective, one stands out like way above all the others. But from a non-Jewish perspective, I've always, and I don't know whether you know this, by the way, Hadley, I recently discovered I have Jewish blood in my family. I was conceived by sperm donorship. Yeah. So that makes me kind of, think, but I want to come back to whether that is meaningful or not. But the Cultural Revolution in China, Maoism, the Red Guard, that I always found the most terrifying. The enlisting of the children of the younger generation and the humiliation of the elders and the professors and so on. There is something really blood-chilling about that I feel is in its very, it's a nursery crop at the moment. It's in its very nascent stages, but that's the flavor or the strand in what's happening to some extent that I don't like at the moment.
Well,
Can I quibble with a bit of that?
Yeah, I think Greenwald said that, and I quibbled with him too.
If I can swallow a bit of food. You said enlisting. I think what's different now is there is no enlisting. There are no shadowy older figures pulling the strings. They're terrified. What there is a sort of and I suppose if you took a big kind of long-term historical view, you might look at it as kind of a youth worship, right? Youth worship that goes back to the invention of the teenager. That we are now convinced, once you pass the age of 30, whether you admit it or not, you are convinced that people who are younger than you know more than you. Now, you may be right about that. They may know more than you. They're better educated. Younger people are better educated than we were, better read than we are. Have access to far more information than we did, for the most part. So they may know more than we do. But I think it's the same thing as sort of people who were 50 being a bit intimidated by the Rolling Stones. It is youth worship.
It's the speeding out of generations in that respect, though, isn't it? You used to say a generation was literally a generation, like 25 years or whatever. Now, well, for a start, people have children later now, so I guess generations get stretched. But also, a generation now seems to be defined by: are you the iPod generation, the iPhone generation? Are you are you the 5G generation? Any new iteration of technology which significantly changes the way we communicate with one another, sort of can at a stroke make you feel like you're yesterday's man.
It's also not even just kids. I mean, I find that charitable organizations or organizations like the ACLU, they kind of stoke up these issues too, because take something like Stonewall. I mean, Stonewall has done amazing work for LGBT rights over the years. And to a certain extent, the gay rights, well, obviously still ongoing, homophobia is still a thing, but they've achieved a lot of what they set out to achieve. So they then need to find a new thing. And their focus right now is on gender issues, on trans issues. And, they are now going around lecturing offices and schools about that. Now, they have had to find a new thing to do. And that's another thing that becomes part of the culture wars. The ACLU has become a big part of that. The American civil liberties, that's still a fight. But when you look at their social media feed, it's entirely about gender issues right now. They've had to find a way to stay relevant, and so they find an issue that is quite a hot button thing, and they stoke it up to a certain degree.
That the Eric Hoffer quote, which I bring up roughly once per podcast of any kind. He says, every great cause starts as a movement, becomes a business, and ends as a racket. And it's not a reflection on the justification for the original cause at all. In fact, if anything, the more justified the cause, the greater the core of heat which will drive it.
But I do think still, I agree with everything that's been said. I do think still social media is so, none of this would be happening in the same way, with the same intensity without social media, because all the things that Hadley was just talking about, especially what she was talking about just before, about the coddling of the young and the sense that all your opinions, every one of them, is worthwhile and needs to be listened to and understood. That's just a version of what's happening on Twitter, because Twitter has multiplicated opinion, so that every single person now does have a voice. I mean, literally does. That can have power, and that is theoretically a good idea, because historically, the world used to be just a few people having a voice and a few people having power, and that's how the world was for years. And obviously, democracy itself was just a sort of cat-handed version of giving everyone else a voice, because it was only really a voice once every 4 years or whatever. Now everyone has a voice all the time. We are in Babel, and it's had some good effects, and it's had some really, really bad effects. And I think that thing that Hadley was talking about, which is the mad kind of over focus on every single opinion being given like time and space and listened to, and things that are not social media-ish, like, well, that person's actually quite old, and that means they may have lived a good life and have a lot of experience outside of the computer, that's completely ignored, because they're not saying stuff on Twitter that gets 7,000 likes or whatever. So I just think
social media unquestionably rewards extreme views as well, doesn't it?
Yeah,
it's not everyone being themselves, it's them learning very quickly how the attention economy works and what they need to do. I mean, Hugo, you're still a professional columnist and diarist and so on. How did you...
I like the way you say still. Like,
well, this is what I mean. It almost feels like that's
still.
a sort of somebody who still does that professionally. It's almost like that's a thing that it's almost like being a travel agent. Do you know what I mean? There was that period 10 or 15 years ago where everyone went, I don't need a travel agent. I can do it. But of course you do it. You do it brilliantly well on a really successful newspaper. But there are, as a job, I mean, when I started doing stand-up 30 years ago, what you do really is what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to get into it. And I started doing stand-up in the meantime, and thought maybe somebody will then go, oh, let's get that stand-up to write a funny column for us, And my all-time hero, I've said this multiple times, was Alan Corran. No stand-up compared for me with Corran's, prodigious gifts and output. It's pretty hard now to kind of make that work.
Well, it's not just I mean, it makes it. One does slightly wonder. Well, again, I mean, this is the difference between the real world and the social media world, right? If you spend too much time in the social media world, you do slightly wonder at the point for a variety of reasons. Because what you're doing, like what we were complaining about, what David was talking about before, everyone having their opinion and sharing their opinion, literally my job. And there's and if you try and a columnist has no place or space to say there are too many people sharing their opinions these days. Like, shut the fuck up. It's like literally what you're doing, right? It's like a comedian complaining about too many people telling jokes, which I guess you can do if they're bad jokes. But anyway, but then actually, although it lingers on and it's quite hard to pin down, and it's not true of every publication, there is actually something very different about what I do towards expressing opinions on any form of social media, whether it's blogs or whatever, because I'm not. It might look this way when something gets out into the ecosphere and elicits a pile-on, but I'm not really writing for everybody. I'm writing for my readers. I'm writing for the people who have bought the newspaper to read me, or indeed have bought the newspaper and are stuck with me, but particularly the people who bought the newspaper to read me. Believe it or not, they do exist. I wouldn't like to know how many of them there are, or what percentage of the readership there are particularly. But so if someone on Twitter really dislikes something I've written, or believes something I've written is offensive, or has an issue with it in some other kind of way, it's kind of like you've got to make an effort to just not care about that. It's not the point. It's like, I wasn't talking to you, And I mean, and sometimes I make the choice to talk to other people by, say, posting an article or a bit of my article on the internet. The weirdest situations are when you write something, you go, well, this will go down badly on Twitter, but the readership I'm writing for will see where I'm coming from. Yeah. And then someone else picks out a little bit of it, and then that's the whole world you're in. And you go, that's just not. That's like 3 lines. Like maybe I got a word wrong in those 3 lines, but there's 950 words there.
Yeah.
And for the so I don't know, part of the kind of the crisis of communication we have now is we have lost context completely in terms of communication.
Well, one of the conversations I have quite frequently with friends on DM channels is about the degree to which certain people think that Twitter is the real world and are endlessly shocked when David Cameron wins a majority, when Brexit, you know, it's that old, was it Pauline Kael? Nobody I know voted for so and so, you know, who knows where it all started. But that, I suppose, is at odds with what we've just agreed, which David said initially, that, that social media has caused all this. There's a certain paradox.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just to interrupt that. What I've said about this a few times, that people say Twitter is not the real world. It is also not the real world, right? It is very much part of the real world, and it is driving I am absolutely convinced, a way of talking, a way of dealing with opposition, a normalization of anger. People were not this angry. If you watch Question Time, I happened to watch it like from the 90s. It had, I think, Blair on it. And someone is in the audience disagreeing with Tony Blair. It's so fucking civil. It's like from another planet. It's so civil, right? Now, Question Time is a bear pit, and Parliament is a bear pit, and all the rest of it. And this is not because some Doctor Who character injected some angry serum into a generation at birth. This is because we even beyond the people who are actually on it, we have been normalized to just say very angry things on a medium that the algorithm suits anger and also suits shortness, and it suits winning and losing. I mean, that's one of the things about, you know, we started off this conversation, I don't know if it was recorded, but talking about the various people, mainly from the left, who have been trying to sort of pick holes with my book about, critique of progressives and how they think about Jews. And I've been quite nice to them in general, partly because I'm a nice person, but also because my project is to avoid that fucking thing of everything is about you got owned, you lost, apologize,
destroyed,
hang your head in shame. That's not a way of talking about complex issues. And it happens more and more. And I think it spreads beyond Twitter.
Do you think, like, talking about Question Time just briefly, because it does fascinate me, and I think one of the ways in which it's been degraded is by having the likes of me on it, frankly. I've been on it twice now, and I just think that's a terrible blot on its record. I suppose comedians who are invited on there are symptomatic of the hope that it will be democratized. And one of the other things that you notice when you watch old episodes, and certainly if you go back as far as Robin Day, is that people were speaking not just with politeness and decorum, but also in quite long paragraphs, you know, quite joined up thinking, and quite possibly quite technical in political terms. There seems now to be a fear that would seem to be elitist. A fear of being seen to be elitist, I think, might be quite a significant problem now.
Maybe. I'm going to just tell the story of why I don't do it anymore, because it's a funny story, which may have relevance to what you've just said, which is I did it 3 times. And I don't know whether this actually happened the first time, but certainly it was in my mind when I decided not to do it anymore, because I did get asked to do it. I mean, when I started doing it, it was not like, oh, I'm just putting my head in the cyber stocks by doing this, by the way. It was before, you know, social media completely eviscerated that program. But anyway, I went on, and you'll know from doing it, they don't actually tell you what the questions are. They say, here are the areas of topical whatever, mug up on those, right? So I thought I'd done that. First question was about this is back in, I don't know, early part of this century, some infighting at Tory party central office. And David Dimbleby, it was him then, goes, David Baddiel. And I just went, I have no idea what this question is about. Right? And he goes, okay, I'm sure Frederick Forsyth, who was next to me, can enlighten you, right? So Frederick Forsyth starts talking about it. And after a minute, I said, you don't know what this is about either. And it got a massive laugh, right? I was right. He was trying to bluff it. I wasn't, right? But I thought, I can't carry on doing this. And in a way, it does come back to what you're talking about, because I thought at that point, not only do I not know about everything that's happened in the week, I don't have an opinion about everything that's happened in the week. No. And you have to on Question Time. There's the notion that, like, you're going to get asked about 8 things, you have to have an opinion about all of them, and I really don't.
Well, for the last 4 years, until very recently, it was it was either the Trump and Brexit conversations were very much like a huge, like grey cloud bank massing on the horizon, and you were expected to point at some particular part of it and try and distinguish it from the rest. It was very arbitrary. I was on twice, and there was nearly a 2-year gap, and exactly the same question came up about Brexit. Would leaving the customs union be a betrayal of the vote? Exactly the same question. Nothing had changed. Nothing had moved in that entire time. So it just seemed to me so completely redundant. But funny enough, I think, forums like this have become a far more useful way to keep up with intelligent, or at least ideas pitched at the level that, individuals find comfortable. So I think they're struggling from that point of view a little bit. Just to bring it back to what we were here initially, talking about, David, your book on anti-Semitism and so on. Do you think that the left take Jewish goodwill for granted? Does that question make sense?
It's an interesting question. Well, one of the things in the book, and actually I use Hadley in the book as a reference point for this, is that most Jews, certainly not all Jews, and Hugo's dad, it was a member of the Tory cabinet, so it's not completely true, but Jews, I think of as sort of my generation, were kind of, I think, defaultly, left wing. I went to a complicated thing now when I was young, a socialist Zionist youth movement called Hub-on-Im. But when I was going to it, that wasn't a contradiction because of kibbutz and stuff like that. And the project of that Jewish youth group was that you should end up on kibbutz, which was the nearest thing really to kind of communism at that point in time, sort of local, rather idyllic communism with handsome people in it. I think that it then became a shock for most Jews as we got older and Israel became more of a bête noire of the left, that we were not perhaps welcome or natural bedfellows with the left. And this book, although I hope it's other things as well, is partly about that alienation.
Just coming back on that, I wonder if you're conflating Jews with metropolitan Jews, which might seem a bit ludicrous because admittedly in British colonies you don't get very many Jews anywhere else. But I mean, certainly in Scotland, there wasn't a huge. I mean, there was a bit. I guess there was a bit of a Glasgow left-wing Jewish tradition, but it also wasn't. My dad wasn't an anomaly, because he was very much a product of this next generation immigrant society where you want your kids to be a doctor or a lawyer. And so I grew up in a community of opticians and dentists and chiropodists and solicitors, advocates in Scotland, and
so did I. But they were all left wing.
Well, but that wasn't that. Just I mean, they may have been, but that wasn't a defining feature. And it makes me wonder if there's something sort of, I don't even quite know how to phrase it, but there's something Holocaust versus non-Holocaust there, as in the expectation is that your Holocaust surviving Jews probably throughout the latter half of the 20th century did veer left. Whether your Shettle descended Jews who had perhaps been here rather longer did, I'm not sure if that's necessarily true.
Yeah, the only answer to this is Simon, who's a sperm bank descended Jew.
Wiesner, for what it's worth, left in the 1928. He left for Edinburgh, funny enough.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Oh. But he was an academic. He was a scientist. I think there is something in that, and it probably transcends the Jewishness to some extent, that if you're involved in politics on the left, you tend to be quite activist, whereas if you're successful, if you're a lawyer or you're successful in finance or whatever, you might lead what would seem to the outside world to be what would seem to be a conservative lifestyle or supports quiet, but it would be quiet, wouldn't it? It would be much quieter. You would be much less likely to attend meetings, I suppose. But then that's how the right have always operated, I suppose, because there's a sort of maintenance of the status quo and wanting to give in the same way that banks build huge stone edifices to try and conceal the extraordinarily contingent nature of their business. The right of always kind of, you get fringe meetings over pubs, during the 1980s, the National Front or whatever, that is when you have an extreme right wing. But the conservative movement, generally speaking, don't feel the need to stand on street corners handing out newspapers.
I say that in the book, actually. I talk about the left being a fighty space. That it's part of being left-wing that you are on the barricades, because if you're right-wing, you're kind of happier with the status quo and the idea that it will lead to a trickle-down or whatever.
Do you think that, to be absolutely blunt, do you think that's part of what might appeal to some Jews about it? Our friend Dave Cohen, I think you know Dave, has said that there's
Dave
something
Cohen,
in the Talmudic, as I'm pronouncing it correctly, Talmudic tradition,
Talmudic,
of just enjoying argument, almost for its own sake, of engaging with intellectual, wrangling things out.
I think that's slightly different from the fightiness.
Yeah.
The fightiness, I think, which is very important in my book, because I think the need to stick it to the man that left-wing people have, and to punch up against power, and the fact that power gets blurred with Jews, basically, and there's no recognition of that amongst some people on the left. That's a very important issue. The fact that John Cusack in the book can have a tweet of a hand crushing the world's poor and say follow the money and really approve of that, and not notice that there's a Star of David stamped on that hand is sort of unbelievable. But it's to do with that need to say, I am a rebel, I am a fighter against power. Whereas what you're talking about is something slightly different, which I think is a Jewish thing, which is loving a long discussion and really wanting to talk about angels on a pin socially and politically. I just wanted to come back to Hadley though, because I have used her as a reference point in my book, particularly in the last bit, as someone who I felt expressed in a tweet that she put out this sort of anger and rage and disappointment at what she calls the anti-racist left's inability to, fold in Jews and Jewishness to their great monitoring of offence. And I mean, I assume I called that right.
Yeah. And then, I'm criticized for saying that. And then I have to go back and qualify my statement, which is something that happened as well when I wrote a column about it in The Guardian, when it's saying, isn't it ironic that all these people, I wrote a column last summer saying, there's a certain irony in seeing all these people now, talking so much about the importance of listening to Black voices and BAME voices, and we must listen to their experiences of racism. And isn't it ironic that the people who are saying that were the ones who are shouting at Jews to shut up? We don't know what anti-Semitism is. Corbyn isn't anti-Semitic. Listen to the non-Jews; they know better. And I wrote that column, and I got a lot of criticism for it, and I said something similar in a tweet, and I also got a lot of criticism for it. And the criticism, it always comes in, you're suggesting people listen to Black people are ignored. It's like, I'm not saying that. I'm genuinely not saying that. I'm saying that yes, it's great, Black people are being listened to now. Isn't it ironic that the Jewish people still aren't?
The conversation in America seems to be getting knottier and knottier the whole time, but the term people of color, which is probably the single most sort of prevalent non-white descriptor, would you expect Jews to be included within people of color? It's
part of my book that they should be.
What do you think, Hadley?
Hang on, I should qualify it because I talk about Jews. It's people of color is not quite right, really, for me. For Jews, I talk about Jews being not quite white is really what I'm talking about, and that there is a non-whiteness of Jews, which is partly actually to do with melanin. I myself have been beaten up when I was young just because I was indeterminately kind of brown, right? And I used to do this joke, which has got a big laugh, about how I've been beaten up twice in my life, once for being Jewish, once for being a Pakistani. And people were clearly just laughing because they thought, yeah, he could be either. But my main point is that whiteness should be a kind of synonym for security. That's, there is obviously all the
It's an unfortunate term to use for that, though, isn't it? Given that a lot of people who are technically, physically, their skin color is pale and they don't feel terribly secure. I think it's a very dangerous means by which to categorize human beings. This is my feeling. I mean, I really enjoyed your book, but there were a couple of points where I thought you're distancing yourself from the idea of white privilege because you don't want to acknowledge that Jews might benefit from that. But I don't feel I benefit from it either. I don't like that idea, and I feel like you want to really throw non-Jews under that bus.
That's not quite what I'm saying in the book.
Sure. Go ahead
I am actually saying although I think it's very complicated, I do accept the idea of white privilege, but the imagination of white privilege needs to be complexified. So I would accept that there are many types of racism that I don't suffer from, that people of color do suffer from, right? But then it has to be accepted that Jews suffer from certain kinds of racism that other people don't suffer from. And most importantly, that it is my contention, which is very non-left wing of me, that the notion that Jews might have economic security, which other races might not within a structurally racist society, that Jews have somehow got around that. A dangerous idea anyway to say it, and not really borne out by the data. But let's just imagine that it is true that Jews have that part of white privilege under their belts.
Yeah.
It does not protect them from the type of historic racism that they've suffered throughout the years.
No, that's true.
My family were very rich in Germany, and most of them got murdered. So therefore, this kind of like, well, you don't have structural unemployment, you don't have, blah, blah, blah. Like, well, okay, I'm prepared to accept that. That is not a reason to discount the racism against us.
What do you think, Hadley, in terms of, I mean, not that this is necessarily your specialist subject, but in terms of your American experience, and where I think possibly the epicenter of this still is, Jews, people of color, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't call myself a person of color, but I describe myself as Jewish American, or Jewish British here. I've got dual citizenship. And it's interesting, the whole thing about how Jews have privilege, Jews have money. I mean, it's true that as a minority group in America, Jews have enjoyed a kind of social, progression faster than certain other minority groups. Not all minority groups. Hindus, in fact, are like the wealthiest minority group in America. But this only relates to certain Jews. I mean, you're not going to get an Orthodox Jew, with the curls. You're not going to get a Hasidic Jew in charge of anything. Those people are not super rich. I mean, like you're only going to enjoy these benefits if you assimilate, and that's a different issue. It depends on assimilation. It depends.
There's a thing that came out literally 24 hours ago, and I wish I could remember the exact details. I should have saved it. It was on Twitter, in which Asians, by which in America that is used to refer essentially to East Asians rather than subcontinental Indian, Pakistani, whatever. Asians are no longer classified as people of color within California's education system or something like that. It's something quite major and serious and official, and from a significant authority, have removed Asian people from that categorization in terms of trying to work out what results they're getting and what maybe needs to be done.
Why? Because they were throwing the average off?
Yeah, I think if I'm honest and to speak, I mean, this is, it gets close to dangerous and to thin ice, but I think possibly because it doesn't reinforce the approved narrative, which is that people of color are automatically suffering. But if you look at Asian results, they do well.
I think we need to be correct.
I mean, isn't it? I mean, they just need to separate the things. If they want to look at what African American kids need in school, then they look at African American results. If they want to see what Asian American kids need in school, they look at Asian American results. But the idea that they need to, adhere to a certain narrative or change the terminology.
I suppose my question is this likely to lead to good results, or is it only likely to get more and more knotty and difficult and contentious and to create...
What is what exactly?
Well, dividing people up into races, at an official level.
Well, just to say that in terms of my book, right? I've had a few people who like the book say to me, oh yeah, but we don't want, or you don't want, do you, to be Jews, for Jews to be, as a result of this book, kind of elevated, or whatever the word is, or put into the same high intense, over monitored categories of identity politics as others, do you? And my answer to that is, the book is not a roadmap or a manifesto. It is an analysis of a situation that I believe exists, whereby identity politics is intensifying across the board, and Jews are left out of that. And what does that mean? It's not meant to be like, right, take this down to the census people and shout about the fact that it is true that there's no ethnic box for Jews on the census. I think it's good to raise that as an issue and ask questions about it. But, apart from anything, I know that Jews aren't especially British Jews, aren't very revolutionary. So there won't be any barricades,
No.
I mean, one thing to think about my book is about ethnicity and whatever, but I am quite keen in the book, and I do bang the drum quite a lot to say this really includes all isms and phobias. So, for example, at one point I talk about Jews passing and about how that somehow makes them sort of, in some progressives' mind, less put upon. And I point out this woman who was Jewish, who said to me, "Oh, you're Jewish. I never tell people I'm Jewish." I said, "Why not?" And she said, "People don't like them." And she just said that in a shrugging way. And I think that that's, in a way, if you're going to hierarchize it, which I sort of am slightly against, but you have to think about maybe gay men in the closet. That's sort of what that's like, right? It's like lots of Jews, and I've had this response really a lot since the book came out, have said, "Oh, I never really talk about I'm Jewish. I feel it's embarrassed and ashamed about it. I've read your book. I am going to try and do it more." And I feel proud of that, because I think that is a bit like what Jews were. And if you imagine that, gay men, don't have, they have white privilege and they aren't economically put upon, but no one would suggest so that makes homophobia okay. No one would suggest that.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting with the passing thing is, people talk about, oh, Jews have all this privilege, look at Hollywood, it's run by Jews. When you look at Hollywood, it's kind of amazing how many Jews there change their names. I mean, I always ask this of every Jewish celebrity who has changed their name, Jonah Hill, Jon Stewart, like so many of them changed their names. Even Woody Allen changed his name. Woody Allen, who's like the most Jewish person in Hollywood. When people think of Jews in Hollywood, they think of Woody Allen. I mean, he was Alan Königsberg. Why did he change his name? Because if it looks too Jewish on the poster, that automatically ethnicizes it. So this idea that Jews have to pass in order to get success, I mean, I think that is kind of still true to a certain extent, and was definitely still true up to the 80s.
I also think Jews can pass up until the point that you go looking for Jews, if you see what I mean. Jews can pass if you're not really looking, but Jews can very rarely pass as not being a Jew. I mean, and in terms of their lifestyle and everything, it's you can't hide for long. I'm sort of fascinated by the idea of whether Jews are white or not. It never occurred to me as a kid that Jews might not be white. But that being said, it never occurred to me that I would ever be regarded as not an ethnic minority. Edinburgh was not a hugely ethnically diverse place in the 1980s, and certainly my bits of it weren't. And when I grew up knowing what an ethnic minority was, it was me. It was me and the people around me, with the books we hid in the car so nobody smashed the windows, and the things stuck on our door that showed that we were different from all the other. I went to 2 schools as a kid, and I was the only Jew in one of them. And there were no Jews I wasn't related to in the other one. And I was absolutely an ethnic minority. But then in later life, particularly at university, now and again, I'd come a cropper, I think, by assuming a sense of fraternity with other people from ethnic minorities that it turned out they simply didn't feel. Yeah. And it's a bit like in that Keira Knightley film where the guy goes, "Jess, I understand what it's like. I'm Irish." When he's speaking to the woman of color. I assumed that being Jewish would be recognized as being part of an ethnic minority in a way that for many people it simply isn't. I can remember once, quite a few years ago, at an event at London Film Festival, it must have been, and I was speaking with 2 journalist friends of mine, both of Asian ethnicity, and a Hispanic actor who was over from America. And one of the journalists made a joke about white people, just the 4 of us in a huddle, smoking cigarettes together outside. One of the journalists made a joke about white people, and we all laughed. And because I was thinking, well, he's talking about the guys, isn't he? And I've never forgotten. It was just like maybe 15 years ago, and it's the sort of exchange that comes back in my mind and replays again and again. And goes, was I white people in that conversation, or was I not white people in that conversation? Yeah. And so when I laughed, was I being a bit racist about white people like they were, or was I allowing them to do that because I was being the ambassador of whiteness?
What you're expressing there is the flickering, what I call the flickering whiteness of Jews. I mean, to use another example, it's interesting you mentioned a film thing, right? I sometimes like to bang on about my film, The Infidel, by saying 10 years before all films decided we have to cast diversely, it was a film in which there's one white Christian person, which is Miranda Hart. Everyone else in that cast is brown, black, or Jewish, right? But I still know that if that film, I don't see that film in any ethnic, festivals or whatever, because half the cast are Jewish, and they will be associated in the minds of anyone wanting to make that diversity point with whiteness.
It's interesting what Hugo said about the Irish. I don't know the reference to the film you mentioned, Hugo, with Keira Knightley.
I'm
but
trying to remember what the film is. It's the Keira Knightley football one.
But the Irish,
Bend
it like Beckham, yeah.
Bend
The
It Like
Irish
Beckham.
thing is very interesting or relevant because in what David was saying a few minutes ago about whiteness as a sort of social category, as a sort of analytic tool for privilege and power and security, the Irish are often brought up in American conversations about that as not having been included within whiteness until quite recently. I believe they were seen as being, I don't know what term you would use, but because obviously they are, if anything, whiter than the English as a rule, you know. But I mean, just to be blunt about it, you know, there's no way you could distinguish like to look at a white person. So I don't know why they wouldn't use that term. And but the other one, of course, is sort of Southern Europeans who were excluded from the I believe until a certain immigration bill in the sort of early 1920s.
The immigration quotas of the 1920s. So,
yeah.
Southern
So the
Italian.
notion of whiteness didn't include every European now, and this is what I wonder. Maybe we are on the you know, on the lower steps of going that way, where all white people start to detach from the sort of monolithic block of whiteness, which they see as, you know, as a burden, as something that's being used against them. Go, well, I'm not white, I'm actually Armenian. Or
I think you might be right that certainly would be something, and certainly I, you know, friends of mine who, like a close friend of mine who's from a Northern Irish working class white background, feels like one of the most excluded people at the moment.
I think I might know who you're talking about.
Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. not represented, and that's true.
That is true.
That person is not represented on screen and
or anything. And he's also talked about, you know, he's a white man who went to Cambridge, I guess, so therefore he's the epitome of privilege. And yet, you know, he's working class, first person in his family to go to university, you know, why is he, you know, seen as this kind of, you know, heteronormative, et cetera, beacon of privilege? I mean, it's
this is a mutual friend of yours. Sorry.
Yeah. We're not going to say who it is.
Is he a comedian or a journalist?
No, yes. I'm trying to guess. I'm not going to say
shorts. Does he have a beard?
But it's quite interesting, I think, particularly in America, when you keep getting these cases like Alec Baldwin's wife, of white people trying to be a different ethnic identity in terms of like trying to claim, and I don't even know if it's about getting a privilege or whatever of a minority. It's about having an identity.
Okay.
And I
think,
you know,
can I tell you something? I think this is relevant. When I discovered that, you know, my biological father was Jewish, I told my daughter fairly early on, she was about 14 and she was fine about it. My son was a little bit younger and we thought this might upset him because his grandfather is not his grandfather anymore and he'd lost his other grandfather quite recently. So it would be like blah, blah, blah. But when I told him, he could not have been more delighted. He was honestly so enthusiastic and excited. And I don't think it was specifically that he was Jewish, although he was like enthusiastic about that, but it was the sense of a stronger identity, a stronger flavor, that he wasn't just vanilla, you know. And his previous, like, he had clung to my wife's grandmother, who was Austrian, and no, Hungarian, and now he had like a bit of a stronger, you know. This is, I think it's quite interesting because although he's young, I don't think that goes away in people. I think actually what the young often, you know, they're less protective of their inner thoughts or anxieties and neuroses, and he was just being quite open about it. I think a lot of people
do want identity, and that thing that happened with Alex Baldwin's wife, which is a version of this woman I talk about, Jessica Krug, in the book, who is someone who was like Rachel Dolezal, pretending to be black, but was in fact white, and as the papers kept on saying, and Jewish. That is people desperately searching for identity that they feel is often, you know, a victimized identity, so that they can, you know, feel that they can partake in that conversation and whatever. But one thing I would say, I think is important, is that Jewish is not that. I think, and it's really hard not to bring this into the frame, but I'm afraid I have to. Identities which have suffered historically really proper fucking threat, you know, stick to your bones as an identity. You know, my mother was born in Nazi Germany, and the damage that caused her and the trauma it caused her, which is clearly was passed on, is so apparent in my psyche that to sort of like lump it in with the idea of, like, you know, people who are trying to claim an identity because they just want to hold their hand up and say, oh, I'm not just vanilla. is not the case. And actually, another time I felt it very strongly is I went to my primary school was an Orthodox Jewish primary school, not because my parents were Orthodox. That was the nearest school near us where I wouldn't get knifed. And so I went back there about 2 years ago, weirdly with 4 Labour MPs, all of whom were desperate to say they weren't Corbyn supporters. But that wasn't really what was happening. It was just a thing. And then in the middle of it, they showed us the security procedures should that school be attacked by terrorists. And basically I watched 9-year-olds create a thing in their class whereby they could barricade the door and hide under tables. And it was heartbreaking, Simon. It was awful.
Yeah.
And that's 2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And that's the point, is that I personally feel my Jewishness, and some people say this is bad, you shouldn't let the bad people define you. Fuck that. The bad people have always defined these things, right? And so therefore my sense is, while that exists, it has to be seen as a real ethnicity and protected by the fucking left, who are supposed to protect ethnicities from that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So that maybe this is too much of a tangent, but that kind of leads me back to almost where we were before, because my sort of Jewish heritage is as everyone comes from 2 strands, everyone has the 2 parents, but on my mother's side, my mother's parents were Holocaust survivors, more in a variety. They fled Poland in a variety of exciting ways. My grandmother came to Britain straight away. My grandfather had a mad exodus through Russia and the Middle East and lost his family and all that kind of stuff. So that's one side of things. My father's family, as I was saying before, are the kind of the 1890s Shettle Jews. Came over, so they don't have the direct Holocaust trauma in their emotional DNA in quite the same way. And a lot of the notions we have of Jewish angst generally is very much from the one side of that. Is because in Western culture, most dominant Jewish voices from Woody Allen onwards are of that Holocaust surviving legacy. And I've always been fascinated by the psychological differences between those sort of 2 strands, between a much more sort of stable, rooted form of Judaism I get from my father, to this kind of like really, keep a bag packed side of things that comes from my mother. And I think they have a very different psychological legacy to each other.
What would you say to that, Hadley? I mean, that's obviously partly what your book is about, I guess, the different experiences of the mid-20th century.
Yes, and also it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, whether Jews are left or right wing. I mean, one of the things I found so interesting about my grandmother and her brothers was how different in attitudes they were, even though they all essentially went through the same thing. They all had to escape the Holocaust, and some of them experienced it more than the others. But then the oldest brother, Henri, he was very conservative after the war. His whole attitude was, make the most money you can, keep your head down, don't cause a problem. And his younger brother, Alex, who had, escaped from the train and been through a lot. I mean, he also thought, make as much money as possible because no one else is going to look after you, but fight all the time, be noisy, shout at, the president. And De Gaulle gave him a big war medal after the war for his bravery. And then when in the 1960s, when Israel bombed, was it Egypt for the 6-day war, and went against De Gaulle's kind of suggestion that they not, and Israel ignored them. And De Gaulle was then quite racist about Israel. And Alex went and threw the medal back in De Gaulle's face, literally. Wow. And so he had a more left-wing attitude. So I don't think
I should apologize. I laughed audibly then, but it was because I glanced over at Hugo, who was snorting smoke through his nose angrily at this mention of
I was empathizing. I was expressing my anger at De Gaulle by breathing vape smoke through my nose.
It really looked like that.
I forget what the quote was that he said about, the Jews, they're complacent something and out for themselves, something like that. It was this famous quote. And from De Gaulle as well, who Alex had fought with in the Free French. So there isn't that divide. It's like immigrants, some are always going to be angry and trying to make for a better world. And then others will be, we're in this place, keep your head down, make as nice a life as possible for yourself. But I have a kind of similar background to Hugo's, in that on my mother's side, it was Jews who'd been in America for decade, since the 1850s or whatever, from Austria. And then there's my father's family, who are Holocaust survivors. So it's two different sides. And my mother's family is much more laid back, easygoing, very friendly. And my father's family always remind me of Woody Allen's family in Radio Days, very rackety, fighting with each other all the time, so much bitterness, decades of resentment, etc., etc. So obviously that's the side.
I've got to say, this is not remotely on the same scale, and so I'm not drawing an equivalence, but I do believe that experiences that happen to you at a certain period in life, you will never get rid of the mental residue that is left by them. And for a lot of British people, my parents, my father was born in 1930, my mother in 38, they will never lose rationing or the wartime mentality. They will never throw away a reusable glass container. So to scale that up to the idea that one day there can be a knock at the door and you could be taken away and put into a camp and killed, it's obviously it's on a vastly different scale. But those experiences at that level that happen to people. The question is, I suppose, do you want to try and mitigate them? Do you want to try and honor them? Do you feel that it is necessary to sustain that you could call it psychological trauma, or you could call it lessons hard won or hard learned?
I just think that there's a more plastic thing going on in the way that I think about it, because I don't think it's just like the Holocaust. The Holocaust is the beating drum at the back of it, and it's in my bones and all the rest of it. But when I'm at that school, the principal thing probably they're security against is Islamist attack. That's the most likely attack. Possibly far right, but possibly Islamist against a Jewish school. So the point is that the sense that Jews are a target comes perhaps in people of my generation from the Holocaust legacy, but in my mind, it's not just a ghost. It's something that takes on different forms and has a modern impetus.
This is, of course, sorry, go on, Hugo, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, so that's I think many Jews have an epiphany in that regard. For me, I had that epiphany the first time I went to Prague, and I saw the legacy of the Jewish community in Prague and the Jewish cemetery in Prague. And that was the first point where I realized that what I'd known before, but never quite thought of, that the Holocaust wasn't just this event where it's plain sailing, Holocaust, everything changes. Actually, what you have is, since time immemorial, various attempts to wipe out the Jews of Prague, and then finally somebody succeeds. And so you can't look at it as just, as you say, just the one cataclysmic spike. It's a journey to that point.
Something that was really interesting in your book, as far as I did get, Hadley, was the and I am sort of aware of it anyway, but you zoomed in on it really effectively, was the shift in the nature of anti-Semitism under Nazi Germany in particular, I think, away from the notion that this was a biblical dispute, which had somehow never quite healed, you killed Jesus or whatever, and had become more to do with the idea that Jews destabilize and undermine nationhood.
Yeah, the shift from religious to political.
Yeah.
And the shift in a way almost from right wing to left wing, but even though obviously it was used by the fascists. And simultaneously that Jews are these dirty Bolsheviks trying to, overthrow the social hierarchy of Europe, but also that they are these, hugely wealthy money grabbers who are going to steal everything so that they can be these fat cats of Europe. It was like these two simultaneous ideas, at once.
Yeah, they're not unique in that I think that, I don't know how to position it exactly, but I skimmed it again, as I often do, a book by Amy Chua. Do you know her? She wrote the Tiger Mother book, which was quite popular a few years ago about Asian mothers. But she wrote a book called World on Fire, which was a bit of a deceptive title. It was about the experience of what she called market dominant ethnic minorities around the world. And in her particular case, she's ethnic Chinese, lives in New York, and she had Chinese family who lived in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, the Chinese are something like 5% of the population ethnically, and hold a lot of property and run a lot of businesses and have a lot of Filipino servants and so on. And her aunt was just murdered one day in cold blood by her chauffeur with the help of a couple of maids. And the police basically sort of shrugged and said, well, that'll happen,
Oh my God.
That's what you get for living over here and treating our people like, and this was kind of, she then wrote a book examining this kind of phenomenon around the world, and it's not unique, but it's, I guess, to some extent Jews would recognize it, right?
Well, so I mean, so the Wagnerian concept of anti-Semitism, which I mean, say what you like about German anti-Semitism, they'd really thought it out. It's really coherent. I forget the term Wagner used, but it's the thing that Jews, in his mind, the Jews are lacking, which allows them to both be the disgusting vermin at the bottom and the kind of the soulless beasts of commerce at the top, because they're lacking the kind of the real human Aryan sensibility that of the proper person, these basically, I guess my point is being it feels like left-wing and traditionally left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism are pulling in completely opposite directions, but actually if you try hard enough like Wagner did, you can very much reconcile.
The best revenge of that is Siegfried Sassoon's mother, who christened him named him Siegfried. She was Jewish, but she loved Wagner so much she called him Siegfried, after the most anti-Semitic character in world opera. It's a extraordinary kind of complex issue. I mean, do you think and this is like just my personal question, but do you think it's something that I need to think about differently now that I know that I am ethnically Jewish, or do you think it's purely a cultural thing that you grow up with? Is it meaningful to be ethnically Jewish without having known?
Are you asking whether we think you're Jewish?
Yes, I suppose so, to some extent. Or I would still only be half Jewish, but yes.
Well, half Jewish is fine with me. My children are half Jewish, and one thing we haven't discussed. I'm going to have to go in a minute, but one thing we haven't discussed is a key element of my book, which I'm not the first person to say it, but that religion is kind of irrelevant as far as I'm concerned, and that people who go on about anti-Semitism not being racism but religious intolerance are just bad faith people trying to downgrade anti-Semitism to the lesser charge of religious intolerance because I'm an atheist and the Gestapo would shoot me tomorrow and it's completely irrelevant. That does speak to what Hadley was talking about, which is the psychosis of the anti-Semite, when it becomes a mass psychosis, is really much more to do with a kind of actual sense of alienness to the Jewish blood. It becomes nothing to do almost with politics and certainly nothing to do with religion. It's just an actual sort of horror psychosis that they feel towards Jews as this not human thing. And I would say, and again, it was an interesting thing actually, which is this guy was telling me about how, in response to my book, he's a guy who worked for the Labour Party, he was on the NEC, and he told me about how in 2017 or something, there was a leaflet going around educating people at that conference about the Holocaust. And it included all the people that this leaflet said were targeted by the Holocaust. And it included gays, disabled people, Roma, communists, trade unions, didn't mention Jews. Right? Just didn't mention Jews. Now, there's two left-wing things going on there. Number one, we need to recenter the conversation towards these other vulnerable groups. That's partly what they'll be thinking. The other thing they'll be thinking, which he talked about, is, well, Jews shouldn't let Nazis define them, right? And I always think, what fucking non-Jew thinks that, right? What fucking non-Jew thinks when you're being herded in gunpoint towards the mass grave? I'm not going to let this person define me. It's such complete bollocks. So my point is, Simon, you would be in a lot of shtuch if the Nazis took over, despite not knowing you were Jewish for a long time. So I'm happy to see you.
Well, there was a joke shared in my newly found extended family that we were traditionally Jewish enough for Hitler, but not for Israel.
Yeah.
But I believe that may have been adapted now. I'm not sure.
Now that you're out, now that you've come out, Simon, there will be a point at some point where you will make an argument and it will be dismissed on the basis of the fact that you were Jewish. And at that point, my son, you will be a Jew.
Secretly a Zionist, that you are secretly.
Yeah.
You don't even need to be circumcised, Simon. Just get to that.
That was the first thing I sent when I got the DNA results through. I sent the screenshot of they send you like a map, and it was 44% Ashkenazi Jewish, and I didn't think I had any in me at all. I didn't know what the story was at all. And I sent the screenshot to my two best Jewish friends, and that was the first one that came back. Looks interesting, but I'm afraid a rather painful surgical procedure is in order before we can divulge any further secrets.
I'm going to have to go, Simon. Is that all right?
Of course, I think we've probably talked long enough, and it's a shame we didn't all manage to get our food in front of us. But
I'm going to say this was the lasagna. It was absolutely delicious.
Fantastic.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
This is the Titus of the lamb.
Oh, look at that. Marvelous.
I even gave the bone to the dog.
That is the final accolade. Thank you so much, Hadley and Hugo and David. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks.
And I do recommend David's book, of course, without hesitation. I recommend the first third of Hadley's book, which is all mostly did so far, but I will finish the rest of it in the next couple of days and update that endorsement. Thank you so much for taking the time. Take care.
Thanks so much.
Well, that was Common Sanity for this week. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. My enormous thanks to our guests, Hugo Rifkind, Hadley Freeman, and David Baddiel. A most entertaining and illuminating chat. Do dig into the Home James menu, select yourself some delicious. I highly recommend the game. I have to say that's my favorite end of the menu, but there are a wide range of other choices, including vegetarian and vegan options, and some absolutely outstanding desserts and wine list as well to choose from. Home James have been our sponsors this week, and we hope to get back into Il Portico restaurant in Kensington High Street as soon as sanity returns to these islands and a little bit of normality is allowed to permeate our lifestyles. But in the meantime, thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.